everyone. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to Matan's One-on-One Parsha podcast, where we discuss deep thematic points about the Parsha. If you would like to sponsor a podcast episode, please contact the Matan office via telephone or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. This Bereshit series is titled Choseness and Choices. The book of Bereshit is propelled forward by God's chosen representatives, Adam, Cain perhaps, Noach, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, but these messengers impact the world because of the choices they make, and it is a nexus between being chosen and the human choices that actualize this divine will in the world that we are exploring in these episodes. Today's conversation was recorded on the 14th of November. Parshat Vayishlach opens with the fraught encounter between Esav and Yaakov. Yaakov prepares for the worst, and in the midst of his preparations, experiences an unusual encounter which leaves him physically injured. Yaakov and Esav meet and avoid dangerous conflict, but they somewhat disappointingly part ways again. At the end of chapter 33, Yaakov gives Esav the impression that he will follow him back to Seir, but no such journey is ever undertaken. We get the sense that Yaakov is relieved to have established positive ties with Esav and wishes to leave things at that. The episode that follows, the rape of Dinah, fills in gaps regarding the children's relationships. Each subfamily knows where its loyalties lie, the text emphasizing that only Dinah's full brothers come to her rescue. The episode is jarring, not only because of the physical violation of Dinah, but because previous generations had gone to such lengths to avoid intermarriage with the locals. Why were the brothers and Yaakov not more watchful over Dinah? Last year's episode on the rape of Dinah with Rachel Sharansky-Danziger, episode 86, was chillingly insightful. I recommend going back and giving it a listen if you haven't heard it. The Parsha continues with God calling Yaakov back to Beit El, giving him purpose of travel after being seized with fear that the Shechemites might harm him in revenge of his son's behavior. When Yaakov fulfills God's commandment to travel and build an altar, his name is changed for a second time to Israel. Rachel tragically dies, birthing Binyamin, completing the family tree in the saddest of ways. And finally, the Parsha lists the descendants of Esav and the kings and chiefs of Edom, all associated as Esav's descendants. This is the way the book of Bereshit parts with Esav, as it did earlier with Ishmael. Esav will reappear in chapter 35 to bury Yitzchak, but we hear nothing else about him other than his establishment of the great kingdom of Edom. Today, I'm excited to be joined in conversation by a new guest, Rabbanit Sally Mayer, who serves as Rosh Midrasha at Or Torah Stone's Midrash at Lindenbaum's overseas program, as well as teaching Talmud, Halacha, Parsha, and Jewish philosophy at the Midrasha. Sally, it's great to have you here.
Yosefa, it's a pleasure to be here.
In today's episode, what we really want to focus on is Yaakov's adult life. In the flow of how these episodes have gone, we last left Yaakov in Parshat Toldot, where he stole the bracha from his brother Esav. We left them in that very fraught, tense moment. And then we did something different. We took a little bit of a journey and looked at a song that really gave us a broad perspective on the book of Bereshit. And in that parsha, as I said there, right, we have Yaakov's, I would say, his earlier adult life, meeting his wife, what happens in the house of Lavan. And this parsha really gets deep into the episodes that are, I would even say, the development, the continuation of who Yaakov is as an adult before we really move on to the next generation of his children. So that's sort of our topic of conversation today. And why don't you jump in there wherever it feels right?
So I think that Vayishlach is a really, really interesting parsha because I think we see a lot of development and change in Yaakov from how he was as a younger man, and now how he is as an older person, as a father, as a husband, and having had all of his experiences. I think we really see perhaps a new Yaakov in this week's parsha.
Okay, so which episode do you sort of want to look at first in order to see those changes?
I think we could even really just start with the very beginning of the Parsha. If we look at the beginning of the Parsha, Yaakov takes initiative to go seek out a meeting with Esav. Yaakov does not need to do that. Yaakov is on his way home, and he could have snuck in or just hoped that Esav wouldn't be there, right? In fact, it says that Esav was in Edom and Yaakov was going back to Canaan. So he could have just avoided an encounter with Esav. But the Parsha begins by saying that he sent messengers to Esav and says, and talks to Esav as Adoni, as my master, and calls himself his servant, and sort of wants to find favor in his eyes. Yaakov seems to be trying to make up with Esav.
I think also it's a great contrast with the way that he leaves both his parents' home and the house of Lavan, where there he knows very well how to sneak out, right? And sneak out and leave and run away.
Absolutely.
And here you see this, I imagine, very concerted effort to be upfront, to seek out connection in a way that it's, I think we could say it's been difficult for Yaakov to do that. That he, even with his wife Rachel, he sort of fell upon her, right? Meaning it wasn't this, I went on a date, I put myself out there, I was vulnerable. They met in a way and he was overtaken. It was like this, sort of exotic moment. But here he's going out and seeking connection with his brother, which is a massive change.
Absolutely. And also dangerous, right? Meaning Yaakov, the last time he saw Esav wanted to kill him. So now he's going out to try to meet with him. He doesn't know whether Esav will accept that well or not. And in fact, he discovers that Esav is coming to him with 400 men, which sounds a lot like Esav wants to attack him. And that's how Yaakov experiences it and assumes, that's what he assumes will happen. So it was risky in a brave and courageous and direct way, which, as you said, I think is different for Yaakov.
Something that also strikes me in the message he receives back from the messengers is that it says, we're in Perek Lamed Bet, chapter 32, Pasuk Vav 6, Vayashuvu hamalachim el Yaakov lemor, banu el achicha el Esav, vegam holech likratcha, ו400 ish imo. And so we've gone to Esav, and you guys sort of had joint intentions, right? Meaning he's already coming towards you. So there's something here that also feels almost fortuitous, meaning you both had some sort of intention to meet each other. But what still disturbs me, and I feel like it's sort of like the older Yaakov still sort of coming up there, is that just that physical description immediately sends Yaakov into a panic. And I always think to myself, couldn't they have inquired about what his intentions were before? All he has is these facts. Now, it seems very foreboding. It seems like a military attempt. I get what it looks like. But I always just wonder, why couldn't they have asked? And why didn't Yaakov say, well, what did he say? What were his intentions? But immediately, Vayira Yaakov me'od, vayitzer lo, vayachatz et ha'am, asher ito, v'et hatzon, and he immediately goes into a panic, and he divides them up into two camps. And sort of it's this very impulsive reaction. And I think that's an important word. And it's certainly the beginning episodes when it comes to Yaakov. And I almost feel like chaval, right? Meaning chaval. Okay, everyone has a journey they have to go on, but what if they would have just inquired about Esav's intentions to begin with, and then maybe this wouldn't have unfolded that way?
That's really, really interesting what you're saying, because I think I identify with Yaakov in this. In his reaction in this circumstance, when he hears 400 men are coming, it doesn't seem like that's so necessary when you're just meeting your brother back again. So especially given the way that they parted so long ago. So I think that Yaakov has a lot of reason to think that. What you're suggesting maybe is that their ultimate meeting with the kisses and hugs, right, was actually what Esav was planning all along, and maybe Yaakov really misunderstood.
Because you're maybe looking at it through the eyes sort of Rashi here, meaning that it was all the elements that placated Esav, meaning he intended to come and hurt, and then he became softer.
I guess that is how I see it. Not so much influenced by Rashi, but just influenced by the why are you bringing 400 men to meet your brother? That just seems unnecessary. So unless Esav just always travels with an entourage, I don't know. But I do wonder if the way that I read the story actually is that Esav did have bad intentions, did plan to attack Yaakov, but then was either placated or the Hashem protects Yaakov, and ultimately there's this meeting. But I think your reading is also very interesting, that maybe Yaakov misunderstood. I just would want to understand then, what are the 400 men for? Yeah, no,
it looks ominous. I'm with you. It definitely looks ominous. But I guess I always assume that his reaction at the end was his intention in the beginning. But I think that's an interesting point of contrast. And in terms of sort of an evolved Yaakov, how do you see that in the conversation that takes place between them when they meet?
Right. So I think that there's something really, really important that is said, and this is actually an insight that my husband, Rabbanit Sally Mayer, pointed out, so I want to give him credit. When Yaakov and Esav are debating whether Esav should accept the gifts, so Yaakov says, Kach na et birchati. He says, take my blessing. And I think that doesn't just mean take the stuff I gave you. I think it may be that Yaakov is trying to say, I want to give back the bracha that I stole from you. Mm-hmm. Meaning Yaakov is sorry for having done that. Yaakov is trying to make up for that. I think that Yaakov is trying to give back the bracha that he stole all those years ago, and is trying to say to Esav, like, I'm sorry that I took it from you. It wasn't, and he's not only is he sorry he took it from him, but I think that he realizes that he doesn't need that bracha. That's not what he's going for, and he's trying to give it back, which is just a really, really interesting closure to that whole story in Toldo when he takes the bracha.
Yeah, and also the phrase "ki yesh li kol," the phrase "kol" always refers to the Birkat Avraham, right? So meaning all of this plenty, right, that I have. It reflects both, because at least I'll go with the interpretation that we gave in Parshat Toldot, is that we have two different elements. We have the Bechorah and we have Birkat Avraham, and so he is saying Birkat Avraham I have benachat. Do you know what I'm saying? I received that from my father in an open way before I left the house. But the bracha itself of the Bechorah is something that I want to at least proverbially kind of return to you. Of course, there's a very significant piece regarding the bracha that happens in between the preparations for the meeting and the actual meeting, and that's in the confrontation with the Ish that he has before. And he, turns to this, again, man, perhaps Esav's angel, perhaps God himself, and he says, and in Pasuk Kaf Vav, we're in chapter 32, verse 26, when he says, Vayomer shalcheni ki ala hashachar, Vayomer lo ashalechecha ki im berachtani. Okay, so he says, I'm not going to let you go anywhere until you give me a blessing. And this constant need for blessing, this constant need to feel reaffirmed, is something that follows Yaakov throughout his life, really. But there is something, again, I'm going to use the word evolved. Anyone who knows my family listening to this knows that's a word we like. But there's something just really changed and matured almost about Yaakov, right? Meaning he still needed it when we almost feel like in that confrontation with that godlike creature or God himself, he wants to receive what he took inappropriately. And then when he does receive a certain kind of blessing or a change in name, which is a question how that fulfills that, and then he meets Esav and he says, there's something almost calmed about Yaakov, that he received what he needed, and now he can give back to Esav what it is that really belonged to him.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I think that this encounter with this Ish is very significant. I'll mention two ways that I think it's very significant. Number one, Yaakov wrestles with this man, and he's the one who he refuses to be underhanded, to reach below the belt, so to speak. Not even just so to speak. That's actually what the Ish does to Yaakov. And Yaakov used to be the guy who, used to be the person who was underhanded, who dressed up as his brother, who tricked, even the way that he had to deal with Lavan. And maybe you could say he had to deal with Lavan that way. There was no other way to deal with him. But it was also subterfuge and being tricky. And as you mentioned earlier, how he sneaks away, and the Torah describes it as Vayignov Yaakov et Lev Lavan, like he steals his heart, right? Which is not a positive way, even from the Torah, for the Torah to describe it. His whole method is very underhanded at the outset, but he refuses to fight in that way anymore, and so it's actually the Ish that does that. And then So that's the first thing. I think we see a real change in Yaakov. And that change is actually expressed in the change in name. Yaakov means to be tricky, right? Yaakov. And Yashar.
Heel grabber.
Heel grabber. And Vayakveni ze pa'amayim, Esav says about Yaakov. And now he's Yisrael, Yashar. He's straight. And so I think that change in name is very powerful, but also very appropriate for this moment where he actually changes the way that he behaves. And I think that so it's really it's those two things. It's the not being underhanded in the fight, and then the change in name, which really comes, I think, as a result of that. I think is a significant part of the story and a significant turning point in the evolution, as you say, of Yaakov.
As a complement to that, I want to just read a quote from Leon Kass's commentary on Bereshit. He says the following. He says, in his striving with his brother Esau, Jacob must avoid being either Cain or Abel. In relation to his father, from whom he steals his brother's blessing, he must avoid being like Ham, a man who sees his father's nakedness and refuses to cover it up. He must, despite his artful nature, avoid the pride of the builders of Bavel. He must, despite his erotic nature, which he brings in from the story of Rachel, who was the first person who really fell in love with a woman in that way. We have Yitzchak who loved, but he falls in love. He must, despite his erotic nature, acquire the proper attitude towards women, marriage, and procreation. He must, despite entanglements with foreign peoples, avoid the temptation of limitation, assimilation, and idolatry. And above all, precisely because of his enormous talents and self-reliance, he must avoid the all-too-human propensity to ignore or forget about God, to regard himself as his own self-sufficing source. Okay, we can agree or not agree with some of that. Obviously, his commentary is going to be much more human-based than God-based. But I just want to take even more that last piece, right? About there's something about Yaakov, and this really comes through in his commentary very deeply. He's incredibly self-reliant. He's that guy. He runs away from his house. He has nobody. You don't have a choice but to develop self-reliance. If that's but on the flip side, because you become such an independent identity, you can have a hard time leaning into other people. You can have a hard time leaning into those who love you. You can have a hard time leaning into God when you need help. And I think that just as a soul position, many people who are very self-reliant, I think do have a hard time just turning to God and saying, help me out here. I don't, because they're not used to that space. And when you bring out now about Yaakov is the fact that sometimes what it takes to change something that sits so deeply at the core of someone's being is nothing less dramatic than a name change. Meaning, how many ways can you express the fact that somebody's different? And we know people who do that. It's funny. I went by my English name. I didn't change my name. I just went by my Hebrew name. But of course, it represents something different, and it's a massive evolution in who you are. And I love that piece that we go from Yaakov, who's underhanded and tricky, right, to Yisrael. And Yisrael is Yashar, meaning at least aspiring to be Yashar and upfront about things. And in his confrontation with Esav, I think, again, he does still a little bit of a combination, because he makes it seem, right, like he's gonna spend time with him. He doesn't really want to. But I'll also just say on a totally different note, which is that I love that the book of Bereshit it provides all these different models for sibling relationships. Sometimes for siblings for whom they're not going to find peace, it is better that they not live near each other. Right. They don't have to be at war. They don't have to have continuing competition. They certainly don't have to kill each other. Right. But an alternative to a fratricide situation might be living in different geographical locations.
Interesting. Picking up on what you said there, they do bury their father together, right? Yeah. Meaning it's that model of siblings that can't live together, but for maybe family smachot, maybe family sad times, they can come together and work together. I want to pick up on something else you said, because I find very interesting what you said about being self-reliant versus being able to rely on God. Perhaps the image of his limping at the end of this story is very much that vulnerability. He's not at his in top shape anymore, right? He is actually vulnerable. And I think there's another thing that indicates that in the original part where he is expecting Esav to come and attack him. So he does all these different things, right? He sends the gifts and he splits up his camp, but he also prays. And in that prayer, he's so humble. Katonti mikol hachasadim umikol ha'emet asher asita et avdecha. I'm reading chapter 32, verse 10. I'm humbled by all of the kindnesses and all of the faithfulness that you've shown me. Because I went over this same river years ago when I was running away and terrified. All I had was my staff, and now I'm two camps. And I want to contrast that with the Yaakov at the time when he was running away in Parshat Vayetze, where he has just that staff and he sleeps on some rocks right on the way. And he has this amazing dream. And he wakes up from the dream, and here's young Yaakov, right? Like you said, so self-reliant. And he says, okay, Hashem, I'm going to make a deal with you. If you take care of me and you watch over me and you give me everything I need, then when I come back, I'll make this into a Beit Elokim. I'll make this into a house of God, and I'll give you 10% of everything. And Hashem must have thought, oh, that's so cute. It's like when
cutting a deal with God.
Yeah, cutting a deal with God, number one. Number two, it's like when our kids buy us a present using our money. Thank you so much. That's so sweet of you, right? It's so cute. And we do appreciate it, but in that that's adorable sort of way. So what is Yaakov offering Hashem? He's coming from a perspective of, I have what to offer. And now he's seen a little bit of life. He has kids. He has wives. He's been tortured himself, meaning he's been on the other end of somebody who's tricked him. And now he's saying, Hashem, I have nothing to offer you. I just really need your help. And that's a kind of vulnerability also that fits in with what you were saying.
Yeah, I think that those are two really powerful points, both the reflective in his tefillah to God. I also think that many of us, that's a very common journey, the journey from confident, I'm going to use the word cocky, but it's about humans, not about Yaakov, right? Mm-hmm. Confident and cocky, young, and then life trains us, right? Life puts us in our place, and I think that I often say to people that if people don't become more humble over time, then there's something that isn't working on that journey, right?
Absolutely.
Life is supposed to do that to us. And so I love that piece. And I very much agree. And I will say that Leon Kass, in his commentary, he very much writes about the physical limping also as sort of I wouldn't say it's not the slaying of Yaakov, but it's like the training of Yaakov to be someone who he no longer can be just on the run, strong, fast, outmaneuver people. He's in a position where he needs help. So I think that those are really important, both in what he says and physically what his life is reflecting at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So where else do you sort of see this evolution when it comes to Yaakov in this week's Parsha?
So I think that even in that painful and difficult episode of the rape of Dinah, which I know we're not going to get into that element of it, but in terms of Yaakov's reaction, Yaakov, I would say that his children take the approach that he would have taken in the past. They trick Shechem and Chamor, and they say, okay, you know what, we can be, right, they say b'mirma, right, they answer b'mirma with trickiness, and they have a whole plot. We're going to have them do a brit milah and circumcise themselves, and then when they're weak, we're going to attack them, and we're going to take Dinah. And Yaakov is horrified by their approach, right? Yaakov says, like, how could you do this? And he later curses Shimon and Levi in his blessings, right, at the end of his life. He's angry with them for what they did. And it's not entirely clear what Yaakov was really thinking at the end of this. In other words, when his children answered for him, right, and made this whole thing, was he okay with that? He was planning to go along with the intermarriage plan. It's not so clear, at least to me, what Yaakov was actually thinking, but he certainly is unhappy with what the brothers did. And I think that that's also an indication of Yaakov's change. His kids are doing what he might have done in the past, but he's not happy about that anymore.
I mean, again, not to overly psychoanalyze, but very often the things that our children do that anger us the most, unfortunately, are the things that they've taken most from us.
Absolutely.
Right? That's the bit.
Absolutely.
The annoying bit.
Painfully familiar point.
Annoying bit. And I will say, I don't necessarily have a theory about what Yaakov was planning on doing in that episode. It could be that he was choosing reticence to take his time to try and figure it out, and then the brothers sort of rushed to a different plan. I don't know if we know what his plan would have been, but the episode is also very much sort of Venn diagramly related to his relationship with his wives and which children who you imagine he wouldn't have just let them be taken if they would have, right? That there is what to say there, and it's not easy. It's not an easy reflection on Yaakov, and also the end of the episode, right, where famously he chastises the sons, Shimon and Levi, and he uses the first person many, many times, right? He says, he says, Achaltem oti in Pasuk Lamed, in the 30th Pasuk in chapter 34. Achaltem oti lahavisheni beyoshev haaretz beknani ubaperizi, ve'ani mete misbar v'neasfu alai v'hikuni v'nishmadeti ani uveiti, right? There's a sense there that it's hard. It's hard to read, that we feel that Yaakov, the focus here is very much on him. Now, again, on one hand, he's in charge of a very large household, and I understand. On the other hand, there is suffering going on that we're concerned that it hasn't been accounted for. But I think that, if anything, that point about the sons sort of picking up what Yaakov would have done, and him choosing to be reticent in this moment, which again we could debate whether we think the reticence was an appropriate response, but it certainly is a changed response from what he would have done in the past. Right.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's a really, really interesting and important point.
And then after that, he returns. Right, he returns back to Beit El. And I'm also curious where in the continuation of the Parsha you think that we see sort of the evolution of Yaakov.
Towards the end of the Parsha, when Yaakov actually comes back to Beit El, builds the altar that he had promised all those years ago when he was running away. So right after that, it says in Perek Lamed Hey, starting in Pasuk Tet, 35:9, Yaakov, Hashem reveals himself to Yaakov and changes his name, in addition to the Ish, that man that he fought with who changed his name a little bit earlier in the Parsha. Hashem changes his name, and he says to him in verse 11, Vayomer lo Elohim ani el Shaddai parei urevei goy ukahal goyim yeh mimeka umelachim mecha latzacha yetzeu. He identifies himself as Kel Shakai, and I think that connects back to the scene with the wrestling with the man, the fighting with the man earlier in chapter 32, where Yaakov kind of strangely asks for the man's name. And the man or the angel, whoever it was, says, "Why are you asking my name?" And perhaps the reason he was asking for the name is because he was looking for that term, Kel Shakai, because that term is associated with the Birkat Avraham, with the blessing that of being the chosen nation. And in fact, in the next verse, in 35:12, it says, I'm going to give you the land. And so this is Yaakov finally hearing from Hashem that he is the chosen brother. He is the one who's going to continue, even after all of this that's happened, and through the whole evolution, right? And Hashem affirms that his name is now Yisrael and not Yaakov anymore, affirming that evolution that you were just talking about.
I think it's also interesting to note that Yaakov has much fewer contacts with God than Avraham does. He has 5 contacts with God, and most are either indirect or limited, or instructions to leave one place or another. And so this, Beit El is this place for him where he has that direct contact with God. And I think that, we have sort of the precursor of this moment of the episode of fighting this man who clearly is much more than a man, but the need also from God's perspective that's not enough of a name change, meaning I sent my messenger, but in order for this to be a real change for eternity, I have to sort of deliver it myself. And I think that there's something about Yaakov where his relationship with God, again, we said before, maybe it's because of someone being on the run and this very independent personality, but there's something about his relationship with God that is a little bit more, it feels, I'm not talking about his prophetic level, but a little bit more tenuous, meaning he needs more affirmation from God. And he goes many, many more years, at least, again, just based on what's recorded in Sefer Bereshit. Of course, he could have had prophecies that are not recorded, but he goes many more years sort of wandering and through a life that is full of a lot of struggle without sort of the clarity of that I think some of the earlier Avot had in their relationship with God. It was a much clearer kind of thing. And I think it's also just important to note before we then move on in the next Parsha to his sons, that Yaakov basically becomes the prototype for someone who receives a tradition, meaning Avraham is the creator of it, and Yitzchak is he's the founder of it, and Yitzchak obviously receives what he can from Avraham, but Yaakov was the first one who's really born into the covenant, and he's also not the firstborn. So he's sort of he's wouldn't say he's farther removed, but we are getting to a place where we have to figure out how to transmit it. Not because my father was that and I have that right in the front of my mind, but I'm already a generation removed. So it could be that his relationship with God somewhat reflects that. But I just think it's important to note that the sort of the prototype of who Yaakov is in relation to the Avot is a very different kind of thing, not just in the midot, let's say, that Chazal emphasized, but also just in terms of what it means. And now he has to figure out how to pass that on, not to one or two sons, but to 12, right. So it's just a different enterprise.
Such an interesting point you're making, and it really makes me think of how Yaakov's experience is so much more similar to ours. We're not the creators, we're not the founders. We've received this grand tradition. We experience galut, we experience exile, we experience challenges. We've encountered the other, and it's sometimes very challenging in a way that Yitzchak certainly didn't, right? He's the olat mimah, he's the sacrifice, so to speak, and he never leaves Israel, and we don't, right? And maybe even what you said about how Yaakov's contact with God is more limited, let's say, than Avraham's was, also reflects our experience. We need to seek Hashem. We don't always see, and we certainly are not, we don't merit prophecy now, but maybe Yaakov is a good prototype for us as well.
I think that's very simply why we were called Bnei Yisrael, right? Or Bnei Yaakov. I think that he does there's something more relatable about the struggles of Yaakov. Again, not because we are the same, but there's something about the prototype or the archetype of his life that is more similar to the journeys that we go through.
Absolutely.
Sally, thank you so much for this conversation.
It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Matan's website. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review in the comments. Please send us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.